Hi Ivan, how's it going?
I'm good. How are you, Michael?
Yeah, all right. I'm sort of trembling in my boots though, because Project Fear 2 has started, and many of the things that we saw in the independence referendum that we're not supposed to bring up this time round are happening again. We've had Boris Johnson saying putting the SNP in charge would be like putting King Herod in charge of a baby farm. He said something about insects as well. We've had the CBI coming out again. What do you think's going on here with the fear elements being put into it again?
All is quite strange, and I think we kind of mentioned some of this stuff before that the No campaign, as was used Project Fear, and tried to persuade people that independence didn't make sense. And because it worked for them then, they try to do the same kind of thing again. Now it's quite different because obviously in the Scottish context, two things. First of all, the SNP is so far ahead of Labour now that playing that kind of defensive strategy, negative strategy, isn't going to get them anywhere. And also, the 45% that Yes got in the referendum, that wasn't a winning score then, but it sure is a winning score in the general election context with first past the post. So the whole Project Fear thing in Scotland's completely fallen on deaf ears. They tried it in relation, obviously, last week to full financial responsibility, and it kind of got nowhere. But interestingly, all this Project Fear 2 stuff is really targeted at voters south of the border who obviously haven't been through the referendum process, so aren't as immune to this nonsense as voters in Scotland are. But it's quite a different target because it's the Tories trying to scare people into not voting Labour by using the SNP as the scary bogeyman.
I don't know if this is going to be particularly successful for them. They haven't had a particular jump in the polls, but we are seeing some of the same people come out of the woodwork. Lord Digby Jones, former CBI director, did an extraordinary interview where he was even suggesting that the SNP are the most dangerous thing in Europe. It's quite bizarre. We've had Piers Morgan as well, from Nicola Sturgeon going from the most dangerous woman in Britain to the most dangerous woman in the world. And now the SNP are the most dangerous thing in Europe. But to come back to the interview, he spoke about capital flight if the SNP are involved in the government in some way. We've seen this before. First, talk about the numbers, and second, what effect do you think it will have?
Yeah, well, it's as we said before, the SNP's economic policy for the UK is very coherent, very sensible, and based on real solid economic theory and practice. Sure, Hosey was on today. There was a BBC debate with five economic spokesmen on, and Stuart was very eloquently, as always, putting the SNP case for economic policy, for an expansionary growth policy for the UK. And as I've said before, the numbers there are not scary numbers. All they're talking about is a 0.5% increase in spending that takes capital investment, for example, back to the levels it was at pre-crash. So it's quite a reasonable, sensible approach to getting growth going and getting the economy growing the way it should be. But the other illiterate thing that Digby Jones said, which nobody pulled him up on, of course, he was talking about the end of first past the post of the SNP. I've got 50 odd seats on 4% of the UK vote. Well, then he threw out a number and said the Greens were on 8%, and he was quite happy with that. Well, if the Greens were on 8% of the UK's vote in a proportional system, they'd be getting 50 seats, plus the SNP would be getting another 25 or 30 on top of that. So the progressive bloc under first past the post would actually be getting significantly more seats than they're getting under the current system. So economically, it was all over the place, and even on understanding the basic arithmetic of how first past the post in Parliament works, he was all over the place as well.
But it's fair to say the CBI have got previous, isn't it?
Oh yeah, I mean it's just as an organisation, it's lost all credibility when it comes to talking about anything Scottish. There's no doubt about that. They outed themselves as a no campaigning organisation during the referendum, and then promptly outed themselves as an incompetent organisation when they couldn't even fill in the paperwork to register or deregister as a campaigning organisation.
Where do you think this is going to go? Do you think that the English voters will be scared by Project Fear?
Interestingly, I don't know. I mean, certainly if you look at the opinion polls at a UK level so far, and they've been at this SNP bad mantra for a while now, it's made no difference at all. In actual fact, if anything, I mean, it's neck and neck, but the Tories should be seeing what they call swing back by now. They should be seeing people drifting back to the governing party, which is often what happens. In an election campaign, we've seen none of that. So the thing is very much neck and neck. And as I said before on the episode about the polls, if it's neck and neck, that works to Labour's advantage, and Labour's the biggest party, which is obviously good for them. So I haven't seen it having any effect. Time will tell. But I think as a strategy for the Tories, doesn't seem to be working. and they must be getting worried they're running out of time.
Very true. So we've moved on from Project Fear in Scotland. There doesn't seem to be quite so much of it, or at least there doesn't seem to be quite so much of it targeted at the Scottish voters. What we are seeing is two different things. The first one, I think in a certain way they're hoping that someone throws an egg or does something similar. And secondly, we're also seeing Project Tactical Vote. How do you feel about these two strategies?
Waiting for somebody to throw an egg. Yeah, I mean, I think that would be, if it did happen, and hope it doesn't, it would be a fairly irrelevant in the scheme of things. I think the media might try to make something of it. But all this stuff has been played out in the referendum. People have seen it and ignored it. I don't think it's going to make any difference. The tactical voting one as well, I would be very surprised if the tactical voting gets any traction at all on the unionist side. It's very difficult to see significant numbers of people it's going to make a difference voting in enough seats on a tactical anti-SNP platform to make it work. Not least for the fact that in many of the seats, there's two sorts of seats. There's seats where it's a straight Labour SNP fight, and those seats have often got a big yes vote in the referendum, and there aren't enough other supporters of the Tories or the Libdems to make any difference to the Labour vote. And in other kind of seats, some of the Edinburgh seats, for example, and some of the seats in the North East, where you've got several unionist parties that are all saying they've got the most likelihood of beating the SNP. So it isn't clear in those seats where the tactical no vote would go. So for that reason, apart from any others, it's highly unlikely that it's going to get any traction at all.
Just as a last word, someone tweeted this, and nobody pointed it out when Boris Johnson made this ridiculous, the SNP's like leaving King Herod in charge of the baby farm. What is a baby farm?
I've no idea. I think you need to ask Boris Johnson. That does sound a bit bizarre, but there you go.
Okay, so we'll leave it there for today. Thanks, Ivan.
Thank you very much, Michael. Talk to you soon.
Terminological inexactitudes and the Lib Dems. Where to begin? They might as well talk to the trees as chop them down to make paper for a manifesto, because after the 2010 tuition fees fiasco, when they inexplicably mixed up the terms abolish and increase threefold, no one will believe a single thing they say. Their manifestos are like a box of chocolates from hell. Not only don't you know what you're going to get, but it doesn't really matter, because all the chocolates turn out to be rabbit droppings anyway. None of this stopped them launching their Scottish manifesto at a patisserie in South Queensferry, where the flakiness of the pastry blended in with that of the politicians. Willie Rennie, needing to brush up his CV in good time for 2016, paraded his barista skills on a coffee-making machine, while everyone else looked round for plant pots into which they could surreptitiously tip the results. Voters may be tunnelling with their bare hands through concrete to get away from the Lib Dems, but Willie remains touchingly, albeit glacially, optimistic. He insists the electorate will give his colleagues another chance because they offer balance and a middle way. For example, faced with a choice of 4 nuclear submarines or 0, they opt for 2, so the UK can still have all the downsides of nuclear weapons while deploying them in a completely half-arsed fashion. Still, that's being delusional, not actually telling porkies. For the latter, we must turn to Nick Clegg, desperately bribing public sector workers by promising them pay rises in line with inflation. Currently nil, but let that pass. Everybody knows this policy has no chance of surviving the vampiric leer of George Osborne or the mad staring gaze of Ed Balls. Like most Lib Dem policies, it's like a sheet of lasagna. However firm it looks at the moment, as soon as the heat's on it'll soften up and be submerged in a load of mince.